The festival had been her idea. She'd spent weeks looking forward to it, talking about the bands she wanted to see, the outfits she'd wear, and the food stalls she couldn't wait to try. I'd gone along because I liked seeing her happy, and honestly, the music wasn't bad. It was one of those sprawling weekend affairs, fields packed with tents, stages, and a constant hum of life in every direction. By the time the main act came on, the crowd was packed shoulder to shoulder. The stage lights cut through the dusk, illuminating a sea of faces. She was just ahead of me, weaving through the crush of people. Her blonde hair caught the light for a moment, and then she was gone. At first, I wasn't worried. The crowd surged and shifted. It was easy to lose track of someone. I pushed forward, looking for her, but there were too many people. I called her name, even though it was pointless with the music so loud. I tried texting her, then ringing her phone. No answer. I stayed near the spot where I'd last seen her, hoping she'd circle back, but the crowd kept moving. After 20 minutes, I gave up and went to the meeting point we'd agreed on earlier. The small patch of grass by the food stalls was deserted when I arrived. I sat down and waited, checking my phone every few minutes. Nothing. By the time the set ended, I was starting to feel a gnawing sense of dread. The festival grounds were sprawling, but it wasn't the sort of place you could just disappear. I went to the nearest security tent and told them what had happened. They were calm, professional, but their reassurances didn't help. They asked for a description: blonde 5'6", wearing a green jacket, and promised to look. The search turned up nothing. No one matching her description had come to Lost and Found or reported anything unusual. Her phone was still going straight to voicemail. By midnight, the security staff suggested I go back to my tent and wait. Maybe she'd got confused or met up with someone she knew. Maybe she was back at the campsite already. She wasn't. The next morning, I reported her missing. The police came, took my statement, and started asking questions. Had we argued? Was she upset about anything? No, I told them. We'd been having a good time. There was nothing unusual about her behavior, nothing that hinted she might have wandered off or left intentionally. They searched the festival grounds thoroughly. Her face went up on the big screens, her name repeated over the loudspeakers, but it was as if she'd vanished into thin air. Her parents came down on the third day, frantic and barely holding it together. By the time the festival ended and the cleanup began, there was still no trace of her. The police kept at it after the crowds left. They combed the surrounding woods, questioned vendors and festival staff, even checked CCTV footage from the gates. Nothing. It was as if she'd been erased. 2 weeks passed. The posters with her face on them were still up in town. Her parents had taken time off work to join the search, alternating between exhaustion and numb determination. I spent most days in their house, trying to be useful, though I didn't know how. When the knock came at their door late that evening, we assumed it was another neighbor offering food or sympathy. Instead, it was her. She stumbled in, barefoot, and wearing the same green jacket she'd had at the festival. Her face was pale, her lips cracked, and her eyes glassy. She didn't speak, just collapsed into her mother's arms. The hospital checked her over and said she was dehydrated, but otherwise unharmed. She had no memory of where she'd been or what had happened. One moment, she remembered walking ahead of me in the crowd, and the next, she was outside her parents' house. Her phone and festival wristband were missing, and there was dirt under her nails, but no other clues. The police questioned her for hours, but she had nothing to give them. No strange faces, no sense of time passing, nothing at all. The doctors suggested stress or trauma might explain the memory loss, but it felt like an excuse, a way to fill the void where answers should have been. I stayed away after that. Her parents said she was recovering, but I couldn't bring myself to see her just yet. I had taken the babysitting job because it was easy money. The family lived in one of those big old houses on the edge of town, the sort with creaky floorboards and drafty windows. It was the kind of house that always felt just a bit too quiet, even when the kids were awake. That night, it was just me and the little one, a 6-year-old boy named Ethan. His parents had left at 7, promising to be back before midnight. Ethan was easy enough to manage. He watched TV for a bit, then went to bed without a fuss. By 9, the house was mine. I settled on the sofa with a book, the television murmuring in the background. The house felt bigger when it was just me. Every sound seemed to carry, pipes knocking, the wind outside rattling the windows. Still, it was just a house, nothing unusual. The phone rang around 10. I almost didn't hear it over the TV. It was one of those cordless landlines sitting on a small table in the hallway. I wasn't expecting a call, but I figured it might be Ethan's parents checking in. I answered, but no one spoke. There was just the faint sound of breathing on the other end. I waited a moment, said hello again, but the line went dead. A prank probably, kids messing about. I went back to the sofa, shaking it off. The second call came 15 minutes later, the same thing, breathing, then the click of the line disconnecting. It annoyed me more than anything. I thought about unplugging the phone, but decided against it. What if Ethan's parents needed to reach me? By the third call, I was starting to feel a little uneasy. The breathing was louder this time, slow and deliberate, and when the call ended, I stared at the receiver for a long moment before setting it down. The house felt colder, the silence stretching out between the calls like a taut wire. I tried to distract myself with the book, but my eyes kept flicking to the hallway, half expecting the phone to ring again. When it did, I jumped, the shrill sound cutting through the stillness. This time the breathing was accompanied by a faint noise in the background, something hard to place, like the creak of a floorboard or the rustle of fabric. I didn't say anything, I just listened, waiting, my hand gripping the phone tight. The call ended without a word. I checked on Ethan after that. He was fast asleep, curled up under his duvet, oblivious to everything. I envied him. Back downstairs, I tried to convince myself it was just a joke. Someone had probably looked up the number, thinking it'd be funny to mess with the babysitter. But as I sat there staring at the phone, I realized something I hadn't noticed before. The background noise on the last call, it had sounded close. Too close. The next call came while I was standing in the hallway, my hand hovering over the receiver. I picked it up without thinking, heart pounding. This time, the breathing was mixed with something else, a sound I recognized immediately, footsteps. They were faint but steady, and the more I listened, the more I realized they weren't coming from the phone. They were coming from upstairs. I froze, the phone still pressed to my ear, listening as the footsteps moved slowly across the ceiling. They paused, then resumed, heading towards the stairs. I put the phone down and backed away, every instinct screaming at me to leave, to get out of the house, but I couldn't just leave Ethan. I crept towards the stairs, trying to be as quiet as possible, my eyes fixed on the top step. The sound stopped suddenly, and for a moment there was silence, then a faint creak. Someone was coming down. I bolted for the door, fumbling with the lock before throwing it open and running out into the night. I stood on the pavement, staring back at the house, my breath fogging in the cold air. The lights upstairs flickered, then went out. I didn't go back inside. When the parents came home, they found me standing in the driveway, shivering and unable to explain why I hadn't gone back for Ethan. They never found anyone in the house. I'd taken the path before, plenty of times. It cut through the woods behind the housing estate and saved me 10 minutes of trudging along the main road. It wasn't much of a path anymore, just a strip of flattened grass and dirt winding between the trees, but it was quicker, and I liked the quiet. That evening, I wasn't thinking about much beyond getting home. The sun was dipping low, throwing long beams of light through the trees, and the woods were still, the air sharp with the smell of damp earth and leaves. I wasn't in a rush, just ambling along, kicking stones as I went. I must have wandered off the path without noticing. The trees grew denser, the ground uneven and covered in roots. I realized I didn't recognize where I was, but figured it didn't matter. If I kept heading in the same direction, I'd hit the road eventually. That's when I saw the shack. It sat in a small clearing, tilted slightly to one side, like it was sinking into the ground. The roof sagged, patched with scraps of tin, and the walls were a patchwork of rotting wood and peeling paint. It looked like it hadn't been lived in for years, the kind of place you'd expect to find half buried in brambles and nettles. But it wasn't overgrown. The clearing around it was bare, the grass flattened like someone had been moving about. I should have kept going. I don't know why I didn't. Maybe it was curiosity, or maybe I wanted to see what was inside, but I stepped closer. The door hung crookedly on its hinges, leaving a gap wide enough to see through. I crouched down, peering inside. It was dim, but I could make out shapes. An old chair, a table piled with something I couldn't quite make out. There was a smell too, faint but sharp, like damp, and something else I didn't want to think about. I took a step back, thinking I'd had enough, when I noticed the footprints. They were faint, pressed into the dirt just in front of the door. Not old either, fresh enough that the edges were still crisp. Something shifted inside the shack. It wasn't loud, just the sound of movement. something brushing against wood. I froze, heart pounding, every part of me screaming to get away. Before I could move, the door creaked open, not all the way, but enough to reveal a shape inside. I didn't stay to look. I turned and ran, crashing through the undergrowth, not caring where I was going as long as it was away from that clearing. My foot caught on a root, sending me sprawling, and I hit the ground hard enough to knock the wind out of me. When I scrambled to my feet, I heard something behind me. It wasn't loud, just the sound of footsteps, but they were quick and steady, following the path I'd taken. I bolted again, darting between trees, every breath burning in my chest. I wasn't sure how far I'd gone when I came across a stream, its water dark and sluggish under the fading light. I waded in, hoping the sound of the water would cover my movements, and crouched low behind a fallen log. The footsteps stopped. I strained to listen, every nerve on edge, but there was nothing now, just the sound of the stream and the rustle of leaves in the breeze. I stayed where I was, crouched in the cold water, until my legs ached and the light had nearly gone. When I finally moved, it was cautiously inching my way along the bank until I found a trail that looked familiar. It led me back to the road, and I practically ran the rest of the way home. I didn't tell anyone what happened. I wasn't even sure how to explain it. But that night, when I was lying in bed, I couldn't shake the feeling I wasn't alone. I got up to check the window and found it cracked open, though I was certain I'd closed it before. There was a footprint on the windowsill. Oh, it was my son's idea to set up the trail cameras. He's always been fascinated with wildlife, owls, foxes, deer. The woods near our house had all of those, and more, and he wanted to see what moved about when no one was there to scare them off. I thought it was a good way to spend time together, something wholesome and outdoorsy. We bought 2 cameras online, nothing fancy, but good enough to get the job done. They were the sort that strapped to trees triggered by motion, with infrared for night shots. My son was excited, carrying the cameras like they were treasure as we made our way into the forest. The woods weren't far, just a 10-minute walk from our back garden. They were old, with tall oaks and pines that loomed overhead, and a network of trails that had been carved out by years of walkers. It felt peaceful there, quiet. We chose 2 spots, one near a small stream where we'd seen deer tracks, and another deeper in where the trees grew thicker and the undergrowth made little clearings. We strapped the cameras to the trunks, making sure they were secure, and left them to do their job. It was satisfying, in a way, to set it all up, like leaving a hidden eye in the woods. A few days later, we went back to collect the memory cards. My son was eager, rushing ahead of me along the trail. The cameras were still there, undisturbed, and we brought them home to see what they'd captured. The first camera, the one by the stream, had some good shots, deer, a fox, even a rabbit or 2. My son was thrilled, pointing out the details, laughing at the way the animals seemed startled by the flash. It was exactly what we'd hoped for, a little window into the world we didn't usually see. The second camera was different. The first few images were what we expected. Trees swaying in the breeze, a squirrel darting up a trunk. But then, late at night, the pictures changed. There was a man. He wasn't close, just at the edge of the clearing, partially hidden by the trees. He was standing, his face turned towards the camera, though it was hard to make out his features in the infrared light. He wasn't dressed for hiking, no backpack, no coat, just a plain shirt and trousers that seemed too neat for someone out in the woods. My son thought it was strange, but he didn't seem bothered. Maybe a walker, he said, someone who'd strayed from the trail. But the more I looked at the photos, the more they bothered me. He wasn't moving in them. The sequence showed him standing there, then gone, as if he'd vanished rather than walked away. We decided to leave the cameras out for another few days. I told myself it was curiosity, a chance to catch more animals, but I couldn't stop thinking about the man. Who goes into the woods at night like that? When we collected the cameras again, it was with a strange sort of tension. My son ran ahead to check the one near the stream, but I lingered at the second camera, staring at it for a long moment before unstrapping it. The photos we reviewed that evening were different again. The stream camera was the same. More animals, more trees, more harmless glimpses of life. But the other camera, it was worse. The man was back. He was closer this time, standing in the center of the clearing. His face was clearer in these shots, but it wasn't the kind of detail that helped. His expression was flat, his eyes just dark patches in the washed-out light of the camera. He was looking straight at it. The sequence of photos showed him stepping closer and closer, his head tilted slightly as if studying the lens before he moved out of frame. In one image he was so close you could see his hands reaching towards the trunk of the tree. That's when I noticed the timestamps. The photos had been taken on different nights, all at roughly the same time. He wasn't just wandering by, he was coming back. I didn't tell my son everything, just said it was time to bring the cameras in for good. He was disappointed, but didn't argue. I thought that would be the end of it. We'd stop, and whoever it was would go bother someone else, or maybe it had all been a coincidence, but last night I found something that made me question all of it. One of the cameras, the one from the clearing, had been left on the counter in the kitchen. I picked it up to put it away, and when I flipped through the last few images, there was one I hadn't seen before. It wasn't from the woods, it was from our back garden. The photo was grainy, the angle slightly off, but it was unmistakable. The man was standing at the edge of the garden, just beyond the shed. He wasn't moving, just standing there, looking towards the house. I don't know how the camera took that photo. It had been in the kitchen since we brought it back. I checked the doors and windows 3 times before going to bed, and I couldn't sleep, lying there in the dark, waiting for something to move outside. This morning the garden was empty, nothing out of place. But the camera is sitting on the counter again, and I can't bring myself to look at it. The flat was the kind you take when you're desperate and trying to save money, not because you like it. The block itself was grey and tired, wedged between a boarded-up corner shop and a takeaway with a flickering sign. The landlord had given us the key with barely a word, leaving us to navigate the damp smell and cracked linoleum ourselves. It wasn't much, but it was ours. 2 rooms, a kitchenette and a bathroom that took effort to scrub into something resembling clean. The pipes rattled, and the boiler made noises that sounded like groans, but the rent was cheap and the location wasn't terrible. We set up our bits of furniture and tried to settle in. The scratching started a few days after we moved in. It was faint, more like a suggestion of sound than something clear. It came from the walls, at odd times, early morning, late at night. At first I thought it might be mice. It wasn't unusual in places like this, but there weren't any droppings or chewed food, nothing to suggest we were sharing the flat with anything furry. The noises weren't constant, they came and went, sometimes fading for hours before returning. There were muffled thuds too, like something shifting or bumping against the plaster. My partner shrugged it off, said it was probably pipes or an old building settling. I tried to believe it, but the sounds didn't match the excuses. They felt deliberate somehow. One night, while unpacking a box in the bedroom, I noticed a vent near the floor. It was small, the kind you wouldn't see unless you were looking. The screws holding the cover in place were rusty and the edges of the metal were scratched. I stared at it for a long moment, uneasy without knowing why, before pushing the box in front of it and carrying on. The next morning I woke early, my head fuzzy with lack of sleep. The noises had been worse in the night. Scratches, muffled movements, and something else I couldn't place. It wasn't loud, but it kept me awake, lying there in the dark, staring at the ceiling. I decided to go for a run, hoping fresh air would clear my head. When I got back, I found the box moved. Not just pushed aside, but several feet away from the wall, as if it had been dragged. The vent cover was hanging loose, one of the screws missing entirely. I crouched down, heart thudding, and peered inside. It was too dark to see much, just a narrow opening leading into blackness. The air that wafted out smelled stale and faintly damp. We called the landlord that afternoon. He dismissed our concerns, waving off the noises and telling us the vent probably connected to some forgotten ductwork. He wouldn't even look at it, just muttered about old buildings and maintenance costs before driving off. That night the noises changed. The scratching was faster and there were faint creaks like someone shifting their weight. The muffled sounds grew louder, more distinct. I sat up in bed, straining to hear, and felt a chill creep up my back. It wasn't just random noise, it had a pattern, a rhythm, almost like someone moving in short bursts and then pausing. The next day I couldn't stop thinking about the vent. I waited until my partner was out and grabbed a torch. The opening was narrow, but I angled the light inside and saw something that made my stomach drop. A bundle of rags shoved into the corner of the crawl space. Next to it, a collection of items, empty food wrappers, a rusted can opener, and what looked like a plastic bottle. I didn't go any further. I backed away, closed the vent as best I could, and tried to act normal. When my partner came home, I didn't mention what I'd seen. I didn't know how to explain it, or if I even wanted to. The noises didn't stop, they got worse, always at night. Something moved behind the walls, the sounds too deliberate to ignore. I started noticing other things too, scuff marks on the floor near the vents, faint scratches on the edges of the door frames. Once I found a spoon under the sofa that didn't belong to us. The metal bent like it had been twisted by hand. The final straw came a week later. We were in bed when there was a sound from the living room. Louder than anything we'd heard before. It was a thud followed by a dragging noise. We froze, staring at each other, the air in the room feeling too still. I grabbed the torch and edged towards the door, my partner close behind. The living room was empty, but the vent cover was gone, not just loose, but missing entirely. The opening gaped like a mouth, and the air that drifted out smelled stronger, like sweat and dirt. We left that night, grabbing what we could carry and locking the door behind us. I didn't care about the deposit or the landlord's excuses. As we walked down the street, I glanced back at the flat. The window in the living room was dark, but something about it made my stomach turn. It felt like we weren't the only ones who had left. The drive had been longer than I'd expected, and by the time the sun dipped below the horizon, I was ready to stop for the night. The roads were empty, stretching endlessly in both directions. My phone's navigation app showed no towns or cities for miles, just the faint outline of a motel sign flickering in the distance. It looked like something out of an old film. A long, low building with a peeling red roof and a row of doors facing a cracked parking lot. The neon sign buzzed faintly, advertising vacancies. There wasn't another car in sight, and the office window glowed dimly with a sickly yellow light. I almost kept driving, but fatigue tugged at me, and the thought of another hour on the road felt unbearable. The manager was a wiry man with graying hair and an expression that seemed permanently pinched. He slid a key across the counter and told me my room number. I paid in cash, and he muttered something about the rules, no pets, no smoking, before disappearing into the back room. The room itself was as drab as the exterior had promised. The carpet was a dull shade of green, worn through in places, and the bedspread was patterned with faded floral prints. The bedside lamp flickered briefly before settling into a dim glow. I locked the door, checked the window, and set my rucksack by the bed. The day's drive had left me too tired to care about the stained wallpaper or the faint smell of mildew. I was brushing my teeth in the cramped bathroom when I heard the sound, a faint thud, followed by what might have been a shuffle. It came from the wall behind me, the one that connected to the room next door. I paused, toothbrush halfway to my mouth, and listened. Nothing. Just the faint hum of the bathroom fan and the wind outside rattling the window. I finished brushing and crawled into bed, pulling the scratchy covers over me. The mattress sagged in the middle and the pillow was too thin, but exhaustion won out. I drifted off, only to wake sometime later to another sound. This one sharper, like something being dragged. I stared at the ceiling, heart thudding in my chest. The noise was coming from the same direction, the wall next to the bed. It was faint, irregular, as if someone was moving furniture or something heavier across the floor. I told myself it was nothing. Motels like this had paper-thin walls. Maybe the occupant was rearranging things or had dropped something. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't just noise. It felt purposeful. The sound stopped and silence settled again. I forced myself to relax, but just as I was drifting off, I became aware of a presence. Not inside my room, but outside. Beyond the window, it was a subtle shift in the air, a prickling at the back of my neck. My eyes flicked to the curtain where faint light from the parking lot seeped through the edges. I didn't want to look, but something compelled me to. I eased out of bed and edged towards the window, my bare feet making no sound on the carpet. Pulling the curtain back a fraction, I peered out. The parking lot was empty except for my car and the manager's beat-up van. But then I saw it. A figure standing at the far end of the lot near the edge of the light. They were still, their outline barely visible against the dark backdrop of trees. I let the curtain fall and stepped back, my pulse racing. It could have been anyone. A traveler like me, stretching their legs or taking a smoke break, but something about their posture, the way they stood so far from the rooms yet facing them, made my skin crawl. I lay back down, but sleep wouldn't come. Every creak of the building seemed magnified. Every distant sound sharper. I kept glancing at the window, expecting to see the figure pressed against the glass. Hours seemed to stretch on before I finally heard the faint chirp of birds signaling dawn. When I stepped outside, the morning air was crisp, and the light made the parking lot seem less sinister. I glanced towards where the figure had been, but there was nothing there, just empty space and cracked asphalt. In the office, the manager looked at me with raised eyebrows when I asked about the room next door. He told me it was empty. No one had checked in that night. I asked again, more insistent, but he just shrugged and told me the same thing. Back at my car, I hesitated before opening the door. The figure was gone. The noises had stopped, but the key to my room felt heavier in my pocket than it should have. It wasn't until I turned to glance at the door one last time that I noticed the faint scratches around the lock. A series of shallow, uneven marks, as if someone had tried to force it open, or had used a key that didn't quite fit. The manager's van was still parked in its usual spot as I drove away, the building shrinking in my rearview mirror. The road stretched out before me, empty and quiet, but I couldn't shake the sense that I wasn't leaving the place behind entirely. Something had followed me, even if only in the corners of my mind. The sky was overcast as I set off on the trail, the kind of muted grey that makes everything seem a bit lifeless. I'd planned this hike for weeks, a weekend away from the monotony of spreadsheets and emails. The national park stretched on for miles, and the maps I'd studied promised quiet trails and scenic views. Just me, my rucksack, and the kind of solitude that only deep woods could offer. By mid-afternoon, I'd covered a fair stretch of ground. The trail was quiet, apart from the occasional bird call or rustle in the undergrowth. It was peaceful, though I couldn't shake the sense that the forest was vast, almost too vast. It was the kind of place where you could shout at the top of your lungs and only the trees would listen. The thought was oddly comforting. About an hour past the third marked junction, I noticed something off the path. A splash of colour caught my eye among the drab greens and browns. It was a rucksack leaning against a tree, the fabric torn and dirtied. At first I thought it might have been forgotten, but the scene was too neat for that. The bag wasn't abandoned, it had been placed there. Carefully, I hesitated. It felt intrusive, but curiosity won out. The contents were strange. A water bottle, half full, a map neatly folded but faded at the edges, a packet of granola bars untouched. There was also a notebook, the corners damp from a recent rain. Flipping through it, I saw brief entries, nothing remarkable, until the last one. It simply said, "Something's not right." There was no date, no explanation. The unease settled in slowly, like a draft seeping under a door. I looked around, half expecting someone to emerge from the trees. The forest was silent, save for the occasional creak of branches swaying. I left the bag where it was and pressed on, glancing back every few steps. About an hour later, I found the trail marked on my map leading to a small campsite. It was the same spot marked with a star in the hiker's notebook. When I reached it, there was no tent, no fire pit, just a clearing with flattened grass where something had been set up. It looked recent. I decided not to stay. My plan had been to camp out, but something in me rebelled against the idea. Instead, I opted to hike until dusk and set up closer to the next trail junction. It was late when I finally stopped. Tired and annoyed at myself for feeling jumpy, I pitched my tent quickly and crawled inside, telling myself it was just a normal day, a normal hike. Sleep didn't come easily. I lay there staring at the thin fabric of the tent, listening to the wind pushing through the trees. Every crackle and snap from the woods outside had me straining to hear more. Nothing seemed out of place, and yet I couldn't shake the sense that something wasn't quite as it should be. In the morning, I found tracks near my tent. Human tracks. They circled the area where I'd slept, the impressions clear in the soft dirt. They hadn't been there when I set up camp. My stomach twisted as I followed the trail, which led off into the trees and disappeared into the underbrush. Whoever had made them had been careful, leaving no obvious path. I packed up quickly and headed back to the main trail, determined to get back to civilization. The park was big, but I'd passed the ranger station 2 days ago. I could reach it by midday if I kept a steady pace. I didn't stop for breaks, my ears straining for any sound beyond the ordinary. The forest felt different now, less serene, more like a trap waiting to snap shut. It was just before noon when I found more signs, a scarf snagged on a low branch. It was bright red, the colour stark against the greenery. The fabric was torn, the edges frayed as if by force. A little further on, there was a water bottle lying in the dirt, identical to the one I'd seen in the rucksack. My pulse quickened as I pressed forward, a growing sense that I wasn't alone anymore. The trail narrowed as I moved deeper into the woods, the trees pressing closer on either side. At one point I thought I saw movement in my peripheral vision, a flash of something pale between the trunks. I spun around, but there was nothing there. I hurried on, resisting the urge to break into a run. Running would mean panic, and panic would mean mistakes. The forest grew darker, the clouds above thickening as the afternoon wore on. I reached the final leg of the trail, the ranger station just a few miles away. Relief was so close I could almost taste it, but the tracks returned. Those same human prints in the dirt. This time they didn't circle or meander. They followed the trail I was on. I didn't stop to inspect them. My legs burned as I pushed myself faster, my breath coming harder. The feeling of being pursued was no longer vague. I didn't hear footsteps, but the sensation was undeniable. I was being followed, and whoever it was had no intention of being seen. When I finally reached the ranger station, the door was ajar. Inside, the room was empty, as if abandoned in a hurry. Papers scattered the desk, and the radio crackled faintly with static. I searched for a phone, but there was none. A map on the wall showed the park's layout, and I traced the trail with trembling fingers. The nearest exit was still hours away on foot. As I turned back to the door, I saw something in the distance, a figure standing at the edge of the tree line. Too far to make out clearly, but unmistakably human. They didn't move, didn't make any gesture. They just stood there, half hidden among the shadows of the trees. I left the ranger station, walking quickly and glancing back every few steps. By the time I looked again, the figure was gone, but I knew they hadn't left. They were still there, somewhere in the trees, waiting for me to keep moving. It was late, and the motorway had stretched into a featureless ribbon of black, bordered by the faint silhouettes of hills and endless fields. My headlights barely cut through the darkness, and the fuel gauge was dipping into the red. I'd been hoping to make it to the next town, but the needle was sinking faster than expected, leaving me no choice but to pull off at the next exit. The sign for the petrol station loomed out of the dark, a cracked and weathered board lit by a flickering bulb. It pointed down a narrow road lined with trees that arched overhead, their bare branches knitting into a tunnel. I followed it, the tires crunching over loose gravel as the station came into view. It wasn't much to look at, just a single pump under a rusty canopy and a small building with grimy windows. The light inside was dim, but I could make out a figure behind the counter. I parked near the pump and stepped out, shivering, as the night air bit through my jacket. The station felt forgotten, like it had been left behind when the world moved on. The smell of petrol hung faintly in the air, mixing with the damp, earthy scent of the surrounding woods. I glanced around as I unscrewed the cap on the tank, but the place seemed deserted except for the attendant inside. Even the trees stood quiet, their branches still. After filling up, I went inside to pay. The man behind the counter was pale and wiry, his shoulders hunched as if trying to make himself smaller. He avoided looking directly at me, fiddling with the till and barely glancing up as I handed over the cash. His hands were trembling slightly, the movement subtle but noticeable. I mumbled a quick thanks and headed back to the car. The air seemed colder now, pressing against my skin as I walked. My footsteps crunched loudly on the gravel, the sound unnaturally sharp in the stillness. The station's light buzzed faintly above me, casting a sickly glow over the forecourt. As I approached the car, something caught my eye. The faint outline of a person sat in the back seat, just visible through the rear window. My steps faltered, the air catching in my throat as I squinted to make sure I wasn't imagining it. The figure was motionless, facing forward. In the dim light, I could make out a face, pale and stretched in an exaggerated grin. It wasn't a natural expression, too wide, the edges of the mouth curling up in a way that made my stomach churn. The eyes, though, were what froze me in place. They didn't blink, didn't shift, just stared straight ahead, unchanging. My keys were in my pocket, the sharp edges pressing into my fingers as I clenched my hand. I didn't dare move closer. I didn't want to look away, but I forced myself to take a step back, then another. The figure didn't react, the grin fixed and unyielding. I glanced back at the station, hoping for some sign of the attendant, but the window was empty. The light inside seemed dimmer, the shadows creeping closer to the counter where he'd been standing. My car sat between me and the road, a barrier that now felt impossible to cross. I circled around, keeping my distance, my breaths coming in shallow bursts. The trees loomed larger, their shapes bending as if closing in. I fumbled for my phone, thinking of calling for help, but the screen was blank. No signal. When I looked back at the car, the figure was gone. The back seat was empty, the interior as still as it had been when I left it. The grin, though, it was burned into my mind, etched in a way that made my skin crawl. I didn't know what else to do, so I forced myself into the driver's seat, my hands shaking as I gripped the wheel. I kept checking the mirror as I pulled back onto the road, my eyes darting between the empty back seat and the dark trees lining the route. The petrol station disappeared behind me, swallowed by the night, but the grin lingered in my thoughts, vivid and unshakable. Every so often I glanced at the mirror, half expecting to see it reflected there, sitting just behind me, waiting,